Welcome back, class. Let's begin our discussion of Chapter 16 on behaviorism. We'll start the discussion with the Russian objective psychology. Russian objective psychology will start off with Ivan Sekhanov. Sekhanov sought to explain all psychic phenomena on the basis of associationism and materialism, the doctrine that nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications. Thoughts do not cause behavior. Both internal behavior, mental processes, and external behavior are reflexive in that they are triggered by external stimulation. He proposed the main purpose of the central nervous system was to inhibit reflexive behavior. Human development was the slow establishment of inhibitory control over this reflexive behavior. He rejected the idea of spontaneous, unelicited behavior. Therefore, the only valid approach to the study of psychology involved the objective methods of physiology. Now we look at Ivan Pavlov, who won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work in physiology. During his work on the physiology of the digestive system, Pavlov discovered the conditioned reflex. He noted that objects or events associated with the presentation of food also produced gastric secretions or salivation. He referred to these as conditional because they depended on something else. An early mistranslation of conditional to condition ended up it being called conditioned reflex. Some additional tidbits. Pavlov wanted to be a priest like his father. His works on Sekhanov changed his mind. So the work of Sekhanov basically convinced him to go a different route for his life. He sold these gastric juices of dogs in order to treat indigestion at the time. He won the Nobel Prize for removing the dog's esophagi and learning how the digestion works. H.G. Wells wrote about him in the New York Times Magazine article, which B.F. Skinner would read, which became a fan of Ivan Pavlov. He was reported to have an anger management issue. He was a critic of communism in the 1920s, even after praise from the Russian government for his work. His estates are now memorial museums in Russia. Ivan Pavlov was dedicated to his lab and he contributed most of the money that he made selling the gastric juices in support of his lab. Now, he developed classical or Pavlovian conditioning. In classical conditioning, as you recall, an unconditioned response, innate unconditioned reflex, is triggered by an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus which naturally elicits the unconditioned response out of the organism. For example, food elicits salivation out of an organism. The conditioned reflex or conditioned response is developed by the laws of contiguity and frequency. A biologically neutral stimulus, one that does not initiate the response that we're looking for, is associated through contiguity by being paired together with the unconditioned stimulus and develops the capacity to elicit some fraction of that unconditioned response. But of course, when it does it, it's called a conditioned response. At this point, the neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus, and the response to the conditioned stimulus is the conditioned response. Pavlov actually used a variety of tools such as the metronome and buzzer, whistle, and light as part of his conditioning process. So, in classical conditioning, for example, a dog salivating to the sight of a person bringing food is an example of classical conditioning, and the salivation is the conditioned response. Through conditioning, the stimuli, which control an organism's behavior, increase from a few unconditioned stimuli to countless other stimuli which have become associated with unconditioned stimuli through contiguity. All central nervous system activity can be characterized as either excitation or inhibition. The pattern of excitation and inhibition that characterizes the brain at any given moment is what Pavlov called the cortical mosaic. Extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction If a conditioned stimulus is no longer followed by the unconditioned stimulus, then extinction of the response will occur. So let's say I condition a person to blink their eye when they hear a bell chime. Bell chimes, they blink their eye. All right. How I made this condition was the following way. Let's say I had an air gun, air puff to the eye, or ring the bell, air puff to the eye, ring the bell, air puff to the eye. And then if I wanted to extinguish that, first it has to have acquired the relationship. So now when I ring the bell, the eye blinks. But if I just keep ringing the bell, keep introducing the conditioned stimulus and no longer reintroducing the unconditioned stimulus, the air puff, eventually extinction will take place. The bond between the bell and the blinking becomes less, the bell and the air puff becomes less and less, and therefore the bell no longer brings about the response of the eye blink. Now, if we do extinction and then we pause for a while and then we get back to it, spontaneous recovery can occur. If a period of time elapses between extinction and the presentation of the conditioned stimulus, if we present it again, the conditioned response will be observed. It's almost as if the organism or the animal here forgot that the behavior had been extinguished. And so this reoccurrence of this conditioned response is referred to at this time as the spontaneous recovery. Experimental neurosis occurs when excitatory and inhibitory tendencies are brought into conflict. So we have something conditioned on two opposite types of things, and they brought into conflict. So one is excitatory, one is inhibitory, and then it causes experimental neurosis, sort of a type of anxiety that can occur in the organism because of these competing types of stimuli. Signal systems. The first signal system, or the first signals of reality, stimuli, the conditioned stimuli that comes to signal a biologically significant event. Then we have the second signal system, signals of signals. Humans learn to respond to symbols of physical events. Use of language, words are symbols referring to the events. So basically you have something that is conditioned to get with the biological event itself, and then we can have things sort of conditioned to the conditioned. Humans learn to respond to the symbols of physical events using language, words, or symbols referring to these events. Pavlov had a low opinion of psychology. He thought that the study of consciousness should be studied using scientifically based methods. He believed that by showing the physiological underpinnings of association, he had put associationism on an objective footing, and that speculation about how ideas become associated with each other could finally end. Vladimir Bekarev. Bekarev argued for an objective psychology, which almost exclusively concentrated on relationships between environmental stimulation and behavior. In later publications, he argued for a discipline of reflexology, by which he meant strictly objective study of human behavior that seeks to understand the relationship between environmental influences and overt behavior. Bekarev's concentration on the overt behavior of organisms was actually more relevant to the U.S. behaviorism that was Pavlov's research than was Pavlov's research on secretions. So this sort of foreshadows the stuff that we'll see with Watson and Skinner later. What Pavlov called a conditioned reflex, Bekarev called an association reflex. Bekarev was actually quite critical of Pavlov's work. Vygotsky. Lem Vygotsky, child cognitive development and higher mental processes such as thought and language. He was also an objective guy as well. We saw him primarily when we talk more about developmental psychology and how it is that we develop in sort of a social environment. So it's about cognitive development, but we want to mention him as well. Now let's look at Watson and behaviorism. Influenced by Loeb, influenced Watson with his work on tropism, shows that behavior of simple organisms could be explained as being automatically elicited by stimuli. There are no mental events involved in tropistic behavior. the idea here is that there was this movement, or I guess that you would call it, that they didn't want to try to put mental processes and thinking and cognitive capability in the area of animals and things that were not human. They thought that was too much to put on those creatures, that these things could be more simply explained as responses and stimuli. So, influenced by his early research with rats running mazes, uh, he formulated some of his later ideas regarding a purely objective science of psychology. So, we look at Watson here. Early in his career, he publicly announced his behavioristic views. His behavioristic views were severely criticized. He withdrew them and fell silent temporarily, but he would come back. In 1913, he presented his famous lecture, Psychologist as a Behaviorist Views It, the Behaviorist Manifesto, within which he lays out the basic tenets of behaviorism. They are: psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its method. The behaviorist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognizes no dividing line between man and brute, or man and animal. Watson's objective psychology. He saw four types of behavior: explicit overt learned behavior, talking and writing; implicit covert learned behavior, increased heart rate caused by a feared stimulus; explicit unlearned behavior, grasping, blinking, sneezing; implicit learned behavior, granular secretions. All behavior, from his perspective, all behavior, including thinking, falls into one of these categories. So everything that we're capable of doing, this includes, quote, cognitively, is simply a form of behavior per Watson's perspective. He also sought that there were only four methods of research: observation or naturalistic or controlled; conditioned reflex method proposed by Pavlov and Beckereff; testing meant to take samples of behavior and not measurement of capacity or personality; and verbal reports, which were treated as any other type of overt behavior. So, continuing the ideas of Watson's objective psychology, language and thinking were a form of behavior. Speech was simply a form of overt behavior, while thinking was a form of implicit or subvocal speech. There were a few simple reflexes, but no complex innate behavior patterns in humans. Our experience is what makes us who we are, sort of an idea of radical environmentalism. So Watson proposed that, along with a few basic reflexes, humans inherit the emotions of fear, rage, and love. Through learning, emotions come to be elicited by many stimuli, not just the stimuli that naturally elicit them. In addition, all other emotions are derived from these three. The research with infants, little Albert, exemplified the conditioning or learning of emotional responses in humans and the counter conditioning of those emotions. So again, from the classic study on little Albert, which we all are very familiar with, he was tying together how it is that we can learn emotions. Okay, so these emotional things, we learn these emotions, and little Albert's research study was designed to sort of prove that. Mary Cover Jones continued in this area of research with Peter, who was afraid of rabbits. That's a joke. This is one of the first examples of behavior therapy. The idea is that Mary Cover Jones was utilizing this as a form of therapy, something they did not do in the little Albert experiment. When they conditioned him, they just let him go, but they did not decondition him or extinguish those behaviors, even though they knew at the time they could have. John Watson proposed that children should be raised in a very objective manner, with little displays of affection. They are to be treated as adults, and Watson also believed that children should receive sex education. He adopted a physical monism position, eventually switched to a physical monism position regarding the mind-body problem, rejecting the existence of mental events or consciousness altogether. Monism, as you recall, is the philosophical view that a variety of existing things can be explained in terms of a single reality or substance. So, behaviorism had two long-lasting effects. Psychology's main goal changed from description and explanation of the states of consciousness to the prediction and control of behavior. And overt behavior was the almost exclusive subject matter of psychology. Now, let's talk about William McDougall, another type of behaviorism. He defined psychology as the science of behavior. He differed from Watson in that he did not disregard mental events as unimportant. Mental events could be studied objectively by observing their influence on behavior. Behavior is goal-directed and stimulated by some instinctual motive. He saw behavior as goal-directed. Okay, ignoring the purposive nature of behavior is missing its most important aspect. Why are we behaving? He believed that all behavior is stimulated by instinctual energy. Humans are born with a number of instincts that provides motivation to act in certain ways. A single event or thought tends to elicit several instinctual tendencies. A single environmental event or a single thought tends to elicit these tendencies. When two or more instincts become associated with a single object or thought, a sentiment is said to exist. Most human social behavior is governed by sentiments. So, we have a specific event that elicits these instincts. And sometimes when we associate several instincts together, it brings about what McDougall refers to as a sentiment. Edwin Guthrie, the law of learning of contiguity. Stimuli which accompanies a movement will, on its recurrence, tend to be followed by that movement. He rejected the law of frequency employed in various forms by most all other learning researchers of the time and postulated one trial learning, that we can learn something in one trial. That's all it really takes. So again, the law of learning of contiguity, stimuli which accompanies a movement will on its reoccurrence tend to be followed by that movement again. Distinction between movements and acts. To explain why practice improves performance, even though one trial learning occurs, Guthrie distinguished between movements and acts. A movement is a specific response to a configuration of stimuli in which an association is learned at full strength after one exposure. An act is made up of movements and a skill is made up of acts. So reinforcement changes the stimulus situation and thus preserves the association that preceded the reinforcement condition. So when reinforcement occurs, the stimulus situation changes and thus the last response made will not be associated with other situations. And when the situation occurs again, the response will occur again. So a configuration of stimuli, a specific response equals a movement. Several movements equals an act. Several acts, you have yourself a skill. Guthrie's movements, acts, and skills. Edward Guthrie on forgetting. Forgetting occurs in one trial due to an old stimulus-response association being displaced by a new one, so something simply replaces it. Breaking habits. Breaking habits consist of observing the stimuli which elicit the habitual behavior and performing other behavior in presence of those stimuli. Breaking habits. Effectiveness of punishment, how he tries to explain it. Determined not by the pain it causes, but by what it causes the organism to do in the presence of the stimuli that elicit the undesirable behavior. If punishment elicits behavior incompatible with the undesirable behavior in the presence of these stimuli, it will be effective. Clark Leonard Hull. The hypothetico-deductive theory of learning of Hull. Three important concepts, including reinforcement, habit strength, and reaction potential, influence on the amount of research it produced in methodology. The hypothetico-deductive theory of learning of Hull used intervening variables as Tolman, but used them more extensively. From summarizing the research on learning, he formed postulates from which he inferred theorems that yielded testable propositions. Hull's intervening variables were primarily physiological in contrast to the cognitive variables of Tolman, which we'll see later. His final theory had 17 postulates and 133 theorems. So the three important concepts included reinforcement, habit strength, and reaction potential. Reinforcement. He's looking at this from a physiological perspective. Reinforcement. A biological need creates a drive, and that decreasing of the drive constitutes reinforcement, thus a drive reduction theory of reinforcement. And we've talked about this before, I'm certain, in previous classes, where a drive, we have a physiological need, a drive for drinking something, thirst, drives our behavior, and then when we get something to drink, we see reinforcement. So this is the basic physiological underpinning of that. Habit strength. If a response leads to drive reduction, habit strength is increased. Operationally defined, habit strength is the number of reinforced pairings between an environmental situation and a response. An increase in habit strength constitutes learning. So now that when you have this drive or this need for water, to have, you're thirsty, you need water, whatever led you to successfully getting that met in the past becomes strengthened or reinforced. Reaction potential. The probability that a learned response will occur, it is primarily a function of the amount of drive and habit strength, but is also influenced by other intervening variables. So the influence on the amount of research it produced in methodology through Hull's theory has essentially gone away. Its great influence was on the amount of research it produced as researchers devised projects to test the theory's predictions and validity. Now for B.F. Skinner. Skinner's positivism essentially was from Francis Bacon and to a lesser extent from Ernst Mach. Scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts, not devise theories and then deduce facts from theory. Science is to be descriptive and inductive rather than theoretical and deductive. The functional analysis of behavior, an analysis of the relationship between environmental events and behavioral events. Internal events have no place in such an analysis because they are events also and thus need to be explained also. So internal events have no place in such an analysis. Internal events cannot serve as explanations or causes of behavior. So from this perspective, we see the idea firming up that we don't have and can't use anything that is, I guess, a mental process or smells of a cognitive process when describing behavior. Internal events cannot serve as explanations. So, operant behavior, his claim to fame. Two types of behavior. We have respondent behavior, was behavior which was related to environmental stimuli that is reflexive behavior. Watson and Pavlov were interested in this type of behavior. Operant behavior is behavior that is influenced by its consequences. And because it operates on the environment in such a way as to reduce consequences, he called this behavior operant behavior. Skinner's free operant methodology allows the organism to respond freely in an experimental chamber in which a particular response is reinforced based on prearranged contingencies. The relevant measure is usually the rate of the selected response. Operant conditioning takes place as the behavior of the organism is affected by its consequences. The organism operates on the environment. Operant operates on the environment. And then there's going to be a consequence for that operative behavior. It is this consequence, according to B.F. Skinner, that matters. Reinforcement, the process by which a consequence of a behavior increases the rate or probability of the behavior. Nothing else is necessary to define reinforcement. The reinforcer can be anything as long as its effect is to increase the probability of the behavior that produces the consequence. Influence, which behaviors are increased and which are not. Change contingencies, and you can change behavior. Selection of behavior by consequences. So the idea that he's proposing here is that if we can change the contingencies of the behavior, that is, influence and control the consequences of the behavior, then you can control the behavior. This is Darwinian ideas can be applied here. The organism produces a variety of behaviors. Some will result in consequences that will increase the behavior, will be functional and reinforcing. These effective behaviors will be selected to be part of the organism's repertoire, while others will not. Reinforcement versus punishment of behavior. Reinforcement of behavior exerted a much better control of behavior than punishment of behavior. Skinner's position was non-theoretical. Operationism is important, but he rejected the theoretical aspects of logical positivism. He was content to manipulate environmental events and observe the effects on behavior. This is basically a functional analysis, is all that is necessary. His approach was called descriptive behaviorism. Behavior analysis. Skinner and other behavior analysts have always sought to apply operant principles to solve practical problems. ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, has provided a behavior technology to change behavior in multitudes of settings. The most prominent area is the application of behavioral principles to helping people in educational settings with problems ranging from psychosis, drug addiction, mental retardation, learning disabilities, speech disorders, shyness, phobias, and juvenile delinquency. So from this, we see that the work of B.F. Skinner in particular has been able to blossom into a variety of areas, including the ABA here, to really show how this can be utilized effectively. So from the point of view of practicality and applications, the ideas of B.F. Skinner have led directly to that. So again, very much an application focus and practical aspect of psychology. So what we know so far. Learning definition. Acquiring relatively lasting information and behavior via experience. We learn by association and classical conditioning and in operant conditioning. The stimulus, the event or situation leads to a response. In classical conditioning, we associate between two or more stimuli. In operant conditioning, the association between the action or the behavior and the consequences to that action or behavior. And of course, in classical conditioning, we have the neutral stimulus becoming the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus bringing about the unconditioned response. By pairing together in acquisition, neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, it brings about an unconditional response. Therefore, we take the NS, the neutral stimulus, and it becomes a conditioned stimulus, which brings about a conditioned response. In operant conditioning, the organism operates on the environment. operates on the environment. The organism associates the actions with the consequences. What I did with the consequences of what I did. The actions followed by reinforcement, the behavior goes up. Actions followed by punishment, the behavior goes down. Positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement increases behaviors by presenting any stimulus that, when presented after the response, strengthens the response. Negative reinforcement increases behavior by stopping or reducing any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. Positive negative punishment. Positive punishment, presenting a negative consequence after an undesired behavior is exhibited, making the behavior less likely to happen in the future. Negative punishment, removing a desired stimulus after a particular undesired behavior is exhibited, resulting in reducing the behavior in the future. That's what we know so far, or what we should know. So the journey of psychology continues. In the early 1900s, a battle of dominance was occurring. We had structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic perspectives. An American alternative was offered by Watson with an emphasis on pragmatism. He saw that introspection takes us nowhere, structuralism has no relevance to day-to-day life, and the focus of psychology should change. Watson, the focus should be on behavior, the observable. Pavlov's work aided in this by connecting behavior to psychological life. Watson saw the nature-nurture issue as an empirical question. He began to study infants' behavior and their impact on emotion, personality, and development. And you know this story about little Albert. B.F. Skinner arrived on the scene wanting psychology to be independent of other sciences. We don't need to about anything but the behavior. So we don't need to know about anything else but the behavior itself. He must adopt operational terms to avoid mentalistic views and ideas. So he wanted to get away from the mental and use operational terms only. He was a fan of Mach's view of science as at the level of observation in the experiment. He used Thorndike's work as a foundation. B.F. Skinner had big ideas about behaviorism and impact on society. In education, he offered programmed learning. In therapy, he offered behavior modification. Child rearing is complex forms of operant conditioning. Ethics is a result of our reinforcement history. Societal problems are actually problems of reinforcement. Now let's look at Tolman. So now we've seen the strong rise of behaviorism lining up with Skinner and his ideas. Now, he studied purposeful behavior. Okay, so we have a purpose to our behavior and molar behavior. He studied purposive behavior in contrast to molecular behavior that he saw Watson studying. At Harvard, Tolman learned to study purposive acts of behavior without sacrificing scientific objectivity, done by seeing purpose in the behavior itself, rather than inferring purpose from the behavior. He called purposive behavior molar behavior in contrast to molecular behavior of Watson. So rats used to avoid introspection. So he did not want to have any mentalism going on here. Okay, if you use human beings, you probably wind up getting this back into your work. So in order to avoid that, he used rats. They can't communicate, they cannot introspect. So Tolman saw the use of rats as experimental subjects as a way of guarding against even the possibility of indirect introspection that could occur if humans were used as experimental participants. So this idea of molar, that behavior cannot be understood by focusing on events in the moment. Now, intervening variables. This is what is the point of us talking about Tolman here. So what we've seen so far is we've seen, for the most part, a few indications from psychologists about the possibility of focusing on some sort of mental aspect like McDougall. But for the most part, it ended up on the strong, hard case guys of Watson and Pavlov, and in particular Skinner, where we see that they were totally against the idea of anything mental. So now we have Tolman. Now he's introducing this idea of intervening variables. Variables that intervene between the environmental events and behavior. Employing logical positivism, he tied all intervening variables to observable behavior. He operationally defined all the theoretical terms. Tolman's intervening variables were cognitive processes which are influential in determining behavior. Among those variables that intervene between experience and behavior are hypotheses, expectations, beliefs, and sometimes a cognitive map. So he's introducing a new idea in this arena, one of intervening variables, which will have a great deal of significance a little bit later. So Tolman disagreed with Watson and Thorndike's explanation of learning. He believed that learning occurs constantly with or without reinforcement and with or without motivation. The distinction between learning and performance. Learning takes place constantly as the organism interacts with its environment. Whether the organism uses what he or she has learned or not, they have learned it. You only sometimes realize they've learned it when they've been asked to demonstrate their learning. So whether the organism uses what it has learned is determined by its motivational state. In other words, whether the organism performs the learned behavior is based on whether it is motivated to do so. So performance is the translation of learning into behavior. The translation of learning into behavior. Now, the idea of latent learning. Tolman and Hanzik in 1930 showed that learning remained latent until the organism had a reason to use it, which was an incentive. So you could have learned something, and you don't demonstrate it until there is a need. Then you demonstrate it. You are now motivated to do it. Latent learning. Latent extinction and extinction reinforcement no longer follows a goal response, and an animal's expectation is modified accordingly. So behaviorism today. Skinner remains the most influential of all the behaviorists. Skinner remains, he's considered to be the ultimate of the behaviorist era in a sense. As evidence of his influence in a survey in 1991, I know somewhat dated, but it was recent enough, of historians of psychology and chairpersons of graduate programs in psychology were asked to rank the most important psychologists of all time and the 10 most important contemporary psychologists. On the all-time list, historians ranked Wundt first and Skinner eighth. Chairpersons ranked Skinner first and Wundt sixth. On the contemporary list, Skinner was ranked first by both groups. Behavior analysis, or behaviorism today, is responding to current challenges. This is not to say there aren't new challenges out there for behavioral themes and ideas. Today, many of the principal ideas of behaviorism are being challenged, and behavioral analysis is trying to respond to those ideas. So what we see here is a great benefit of what behaviorism has done by way of its legacy.